It's really lovely to see people, both downstairs and upstairs, and I know hundreds of people online. Welcome, colleagues and community members from on campus and off. I'm Lisa Henderson. I'm the proud Dean of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, your host this afternoon, and I am really more than delighted to welcome you and all our online guests to Conran Hall to join distinguished journalist, broadcaster, and CBC Ideas host, Nahlah Ayed, this year's FIMS Clissold Lecturer. To begin, a land acknowledgement, which takes on a special significance as land remains perhaps the most contested and complex resource globally, and as Nahlah Ayed speaks to journalism's reinvention of foreign correspondence covering the world in a post-truth era. I want to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, the Napewook, and Chinaltam nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land is home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, whom we recognize as the abiding stewards of the land and historical and contemporary leaders of our society. In education, as in journalism, we acknowledge the ongoing injustice that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to reveal and correct miseducation and renew respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, our research, coverage, and community service. I especially want to thank our colleagues Sarah May Chitty and Christy Brissett in the Office of Indigenous Initiatives for their work at Western, including their work right now on developing allyship, whose efforts the project of decolonization and indigenization at Western really needs. My colleague in FIMS, Christopher Arsenault, who is the new graduate program chair of our Master of Media in Journalism and Communication, or MMJC program, will shortly introduce Nahlah Ayed and speak to the legacy of Edward Clissold, in honor of whom this annual lecture was endowed by later and indeed living generations of his family. But in recognition of our full house and our tapped out online audience, permit me to express our appreciation to Nahlah, who I know to be an artful public interlocutor as well as broadcaster and writer. I've had the pleasure of being in your live audience at the Stratford Festival, Nahlah, where special summer series of ideas are recorded. And I want to acknowledge to everyone here that it's not the broadcast production that makes ideas special, though it's great. It's your distinguished capacity to listen, think, and talk with people and to quietly revel in that practice, which draws us. We have reserved time afterwards for questions and answers, which I'll moderate. We'll only be able to circulate mics downstairs. So if you're upstairs and have a question, please come down and join us down here, and we'll pass you the mic. If you're in our online audience, hopefully someone in the room will ask the question you have in mind. We then welcome those of you in the room to join us for a brief reception in the space behind Conran Hall. The university store, I have not just used the full name of it, the Delis Family University Store is selling books by Nahlah Ayed at the side table, though we have not orchestrated a signing, just so that you know if you're buying books. Thank you for being here, to Nahlah Ayed and to everyone, and Chris, over to you.
So for folks in the audience who haven't worked in a newsroom, I'll let you in on a little industry secret. Among journalists at some outlets, there can be a bit of a friendly rivalry between print reporters and on-air talent. Print reporters believe we're the ones who have to get it right and get it first. We dig the well from which journalism springs, and in a sense, we write the first page of history. But print reporters typically do this in the shadows. We don't get recognized on the street, and we usually don't have the same public profiles as on-air talent. Given this, there's a tendency from some old guard print journalists to see on-air personalities as just a nice-sounding voice or telegenic face. Some on-air personalities return the favor, viewing print reporters as the grunts of the newsroom, bashing away on keyboards in uninspiring cubicles. Maybe let them out for coffee on occasion, but definitely don't put them in front of the audience. What's so impressive about tonight's speaker is she's worked between both solitudes at the very highest levels. She didn't ask for her piece, she took it, through grit, hustle, and above all, stellar reporting. Nahlah Ayed started as a freelancer with the Ottawa Citizen and moved to the Canadian Press as a parliamentary reporter. From there, she joined the CBC, also as a freelancer, and went on to cover some of the biggest stories of the 2000s, including the fall of Baghdad after the US invasion. I could take this whole introduction listing her various accolades, but to keep it brief, she's won 2 online journalism awards, a Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Human Rights Reporting, a Canadian Screen Award, and Story of the Year from the Foreign Press Association. Oh yeah, and she was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award for her book, 1,000 Farewells, A Reporter's Journey from Refugee Camp to the Arab Spring. Tonight's annual Clissold Lecture commemorates the life and work of Edward Clissold. Born in 1833, he was one of London's most important early editors and journalists. A bequest from the estate of Clissold's grandson, Robert Blount, and his wife, Rose Blount, enabled us to create this annual lecture series to commemorate Edward Clissold's legacy. It's a highlight of the annual calendar for our journalism and communications program. No, it's no secret that these are difficult times for our industry, but we will keep telling the stories that matter. With the experiences of reporters like Edward Clissold at our backs, it is my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker. Let's give a warm Western welcome to the award-winning foreign correspondent and host of CBC's Ideas, Nahlah Ayed.
Oh, nice. Thank you. You're so sweet. I got him right. Yeah. Forgive me while I get organized. Is there some way to lift this? No. Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much, Chris, for the generous introduction. Thank you, Lisa, for the very kind words. It's really wonderful to finally be with you today. It's been long in coming. I'm really appreciative of being here. I feel honored. It's truly a privilege to follow in the footsteps of some of my journalistic heroes in honoring the legacy of Edward Clissold and his work here in London. Thank you for the rare opportunity to pause and think about our work and to come and share some of those thoughts with you here. And thank you all here for being here today. And thanks all of you who are here online as well. It's an honor to be with you. So let me start by saying, can you hear me all right? I see a hand already. Yeah, okay, good. Let me start by saying that it's been almost 6 years since one of my last assignments as a full-time foreign correspondent. In March 2019, I was in Mozambique, covering the aftermath of a cyclone. Within weeks, I would be in India, covering the world's largest election for the second time in my life. And then weeks after that, in the summer of 2019, I moved back to Canada from London, ending nearly 20 years in the field. And so I come here humbly to you, no longer as a practitioner of foreign journalism, but as an observer of world news, one who has a lot of opinions on how it's covered. I also come here, as Chris mentioned, as a host of a show that specializes in traveling. But rather than jumping on a plane, it's travel in pursuit of ideas across space and time. But I am here ultimately as an avid member of the once a foreign correspondent, always a foreign correspondent club. It's a little bit like a nunnery. You kind of give your life over to it, and you never really leave it. It's simply part of who I am. It's a way of thinking, and it's the lens through which I see the world.
So for the record, and just to preempt the question right off the bat, yes, it has been incredibly difficult at times standing back and watching from afar some of the profoundly ground-shifting events unfolding in places I used to cover closely before I chose to walk away from my life's passion. Places I know, like Syria, Ukraine, Beirut, and Gaza. It's also been intensely challenging to sit still as the world order as we know it basically unravels. I'm not trying to be dark here, but it is kind of what's happening. This is a story that none of us can afford to miss. But in the past few years, I would find myself often thinking of the words of Greg Kelly, who's our executive producer at Ideas, who told me when he first hired me for my current job that while I would indeed continue to get out the door, as we like to call it in my business, to travel and do some stories for Ideas, that my focus was now on journeys of the mind. And of course, his words couldn't have been more prescient or more useful, especially as the pandemic grounded all of us entirely. There was only journeys of the mind then. That's all that was left for most of us. Now, during that time, and for the first time really since I was in my 30s, which is quite a while ago, I had the chance to really contemplate the world from this end, to think about the importance of bearing witness to what happens in our world, and therefore the enduring relevance of those people, the foreign correspondents, who still go out there day in, day out, to bring us news of a world that at times these days seems increasingly foreign. Now, looking back over these past nearly 6 years, it's really been quite an incredible trip, both as a spectator to world news and at the same time as a traveler on a voyage into thought and ideas that can and have changed the world. And that has really been instructive and revelatory at a time when the world is changing at an unprecedented pace. Back when I graduated journalism school, as ever, there were deep divisions and disputes over what constitutes the truth, but we could hardly imagine the post-truth world that we live in now. Nor could we possibly conceive of the idea that big tech would literally be ruling the world. In the intervening 30 years or so, the media landscape, as you well know, has also changed dramatically, with many new players, audiences fractured and atomized, and news budgets having shrunk, and along with it, our attention span. So the way, of course, in which we cover the world and its misfortunes has also changed, and particularly in the Canadian context, where over the years it has been, and let us not sugarcoat this, downsized into near oblivion. Most foreign bureaus have been shuttered for good, even in the world's hottest zones, and the ranks of correspondents have been decimated. Some would even go as far as saying that the whole Western model of foreign reportage is broken, maybe even no longer fit for purpose. I disagree, personally. There is work to be done, no doubt, to improve our coverage of the world. When I say our, I mean all foreign correspondents, not just CBC, but the way this business is run, to enable our journalists abroad to serve us even better within the constraints that we all have to contend with in this business today. But those foreign correspondents who are still standing still do stellar, valuable work, despite all the challenges. And we need them now, I would argue, more than ever. When we look back, it's actually incredibly, it's remarkable how our craft has adapted to all the change that has come over the years, when you think about it. I'm old enough to remember the tail end of what you might call the heydays of foreign journalism. I see a few people who might remember those days. When money, at least seen from today's vantage point, seemed to be no object. It was a time when major foreign bureaus housed editors. Well, these are the broadcast bureaus. They had editors and advertising people and drivers among their staff. And when a television foreign correspondent, and yes, that would be a different person from the radio correspondent, would travel with a dozen heavy boxes of equipment costing a hefty bill in extra baggage fees, and with a producer and a cameraman, and yes, they were almost exclusively cameramen, then at the end of the day, report and produce one news piece for the evening newscast. I'm also old enough to remember, and I did this myself, when delivering a TV piece from abroad meant physically taking the tape over to a satellite point, a tape, it was about this size, connecting to London by phone, and then watching as we played the piece in real time while the other side recorded. I first encountered this in Baghdad, pre-invasion in 2002, and that's where I learned the financial cost of missing deadlines. It cost $1,000 for a minimum 10-minute window to send your article that way. Even for someone who's quite used to deadlines, those were terrifying because you never wanted to be the person who squandered that kind of money by being just a few minutes late. Back then, without the din of hundreds of channels of at your fingertips, Netflix and 34 million TikTok videos daily, the work of Canadian foreign correspondents, at least to me, seemed more consequential, more influential. What journalists reported from abroad mattered and could even influence the larger conversation. I do remember days that, even when I was doing this work, that some of our own reporting on a crisis or a disaster would measurably compel Canadians to open their wallets, and then donations for this famine or that earthquake relief would soar. And if you look back just a little bit further back than my own career, the other major feature of the Foreign Press Corps was that they were largely men and white. That narrow gaze changed with the arrival of a whole generation of courageous women who entered the field, like Trailblazer Ann Medina, the only other CBCer that I know who opened a Beirut office, and who only 3 years ago was finally inducted into the CBC News Hall of Fame. So fast forward 3 decades, that's all, just 3 decades, and almost everything has changed. Our societies have become more diverse, and so have our audiences, as well as our ranks as journalists, not least because of the fact that a whole generation of legendary journalists who shaped this business in Canada, both the national fixtures and the foreign correspondents, have all but moved on. The information ecosystem has been transformed, one that now boasts a multitude of voices and opinions that can be had at the tip of our fingers, and one notably where opinion seems to be increasingly valued over fact. The technology has evolved lightning fast. There are no more satellite feeds. And journalists have had to navigate generations of new tech and modes of transmission. The revenue model for mainstream private media has collapsed, and daily demands for content in most newsrooms have risen dramatically as our business crossfades from traditional to digital formats. And all along the way, foreign correspondents, a term, by the way, by which I mean it's shorthand, not just for the people in front of the camera, but also the producers, the videographers, the photographers, and the writers who do the exact same work. They have simply had to adapt, just like we have to in the field. And if nothing else, foreign correspondents are fantastic at adapting. It is what we do, what I used to do. In fact, journalists in the field have borne the brunt of all this change. To start with, more demands with fewer boots on the ground has meant an increasingly heavier workload. The modern foreign journalist is now forced not only to contend with the special challenges of getting to a foreign country and making sure they can gather safely and then file from there, which is no small feat in most places we go, but then now they must report for a whole number of platforms, especially in the broadcast realm. So depending on who they work for, that could be written, audio, video, photos, social posts, interviews for various shows, and then finally a piece for the evening newscast or the newspaper the next day. And even as foreign correspondents were becoming more productive than ever, sending them abroad was also becoming more expensive than ever. With cost a factor and increasing dangers adding to the toll, both of the financial and the psychological kind, the bar to send people into the field seemed to only get higher. And so whenever it was time to make cuts yet again, foreign journalism was a very easy target. As a result, their numbers have dwindled, bureaus have shut down, and corners have been repeatedly and deeply cut. The result, over time, of all these pressures, they've slowly created what I believed at the time when I was doing this, an increasingly unsustainable form of foreign journalism. The reason I believe that is because, for one, some corners of the world have simply become beyond the reach of Canadian outlets and of any but the most global brands of journalism like the BBC and Al Jazeera. For every local news desert in Canada, there is something akin to the Sahara on every continent abroad. Disturbingly, for the purist, to adapt to the dwindling resources, we were increasingly reporting on foreign stories from afar, from London, from Washington, and even Toronto, using agency footage. It is a necessity in an environment where resources are precious. We cannot be everywhere, but unsettling nevertheless, and kind of the antithesis of the definition of foreign journalism. When we were in the field, the time and platform demands also slowly chipped away at our capacity to do original journalism. Of course, we would report, but our ability to do that dwindled with the multitude of demands in a single news day. In addition, there were structural issues that arose with the way we covered modern conflict. And because of the unprecedented pace of news, we rarely had the chance to reflect on how we did our work and how that might evolve with events. So let me give you an example. And this is an example that troubled me constantly. That period when I was based in London and when we were covering bomb attack after bomb attack in Europe, while also neglecting similar events by similar actors who unleashed attacks on an even deadlier scale in places like the Middle East and Africa. It was again an inevitable state of affairs when resources were so precious. The Middle East and Africa are simply much harder to get to. We had little presence in those places to speak of, which is, of course, the original sin. We had to pick our battles. But that didn't make it right or fair or justifiable or avoidable. But audiences noticed, and we noticed. By doing this, unavoidable as it was, were we contributing? I would ask myself this: were we contributing to the othering of the victims in those regions? Were we contributing to their dehumanization? Did European lives matter more than African ones? If you watch the coverage of such events in the West back then, you might conclude the answer is in the affirmative. There was also something in the way we covered these stories, especially these violent stories, that worried me as well. In the case, for example, of bombings in Europe or elsewhere, or the school shootings in the US, naturally, we would begin with the what, who, when, where, how it all happened, some sense of the culprit and the motive. If it's known, crucially, was it a quote-unquote terrorist attack? And then the aftermath, the candlelight vigils, getting to know the victims, speaking to their families, all of it worthy journalism and necessary. But then we would rarely go beyond that in daily news. And we would do all this again and again without the ability to stop and think about how else we could be covering these stories, about whether we could adopt a more investigative posture, for instance, instead of simply amplifying emotion. We're good. But in the news business, the demands were relentless. And we did not have the time to consider how our coverage of these repeated violent events impacted the world, whom we hurt, whom we helped, whose message we amplified, whom we excluded, and whether we were contributing to the growing intolerance or deepening the hate. Over time, I certainly saw evidence that suggested the latter. Finally, with less and less space available for broadcasts or written stories, there was less and less room in daily news for context, history, and meaning. This was particularly frustrating in the more complicated stories that we would cover. And I don't just mean the Middle East. Every story has a history. Every player has a past. And every event has meaning attached to it worthy of exploration and analysis. And in my books, every news story that neglects to at least nod to some of that does a disservice to our audiences. The result of all this, in my mind, again, this is just me talking, was not always, but often, a subversion of what I thought our mission was as foreign correspondents. It was partly actually what compelled me to find a way to move on. This desire for more space, for the opportunity to focus on meaning and history and context. And I've learned since that audiences want that too. So how would I help find our way to more authentic and fulsome foreign reporting? How do we do that given the new challenges of an upended, accelerated, and frankly uncharted world news environment, the rise of disruptive authoritarian figures who don't like the media anyway, domestic or foreign, and the stark difference of opinion on reality itself? Again, my answers are just my answers, my opinion, and they're just as informed by my journey and ideas as well as my work as a foreign correspondent. So to start with, I think we should recommit to the idea of the foreign correspondent, going out into the world and bearing witness. I am not pretending we can operate apart from the reality of newsrooms across the country, which are all hurting. I am saying let's stem the tide. Let's protect what we have left and enable the remaining foreign journalists to do the best job they can, with some updates to help adapt to this young and violent and chaotic century. And let's also, at the same time, commit to preparing the next generation of foreign journalists, who surely we will need as much as we need those we have now. Because if anything, as you well know, for the evidence is amply on display, we need more nuanced international coverage in this post-truth age than ever. And going there physically is at the heart of what journalists of any kind must do. Nothing makes up for being there in the flesh. It's great because it's giving my voice a break. Should I move back? Move this with me? Okay, let's try that. So we know, obviously, from the searing imagery and sounds we've taken in over the years of the reporters covering world wars, the Lebanese Civil War, 2003 US invasion of Iraq, the 80s famine in Ethiopia, etc. We know the strength of journalists being on the ground. We also know deep down the importance, as writer Robert McFarlane told me in a recent interview, of seeing the landscape of a place to truly understand the people who have grown up in its embrace. We also understand when anthropologist Wade Davis talks about the utility of crossing the road, as he described it recently to our producer Philip Coulter, to pick up the rhythm of another place, another culture, and connect to another people. We can go back even further and borrow from Thucydides, the first journalist and war correspondent, as our senior producer Nahlah Ayed described him in a recent episode, who wrote a report of some 500 pages worth on the Peloponnesian War, traveling extensively to talk to people involved from all sides. He wrote, "I was present myself at the events which I have described." He wrote that in the history of the Peloponnesian War. Or else I heard it from eyewitnesses whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. not that the truth was easy to discover. It will be enough for me, he wrote, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past, which human nature, being what it is, will at some point or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. It's exactly the ethos necessary among foreign correspondents, and it's only achievable by going to see the people where they live and experience, or at least witness, what they experience firsthand. And so back to the idea that in this modern world, in the absence of bureaus abroad, it does mean dispatching experienced Canadian journalists to stories as they come up. It's mostly what we do now to cover major world stories like Ukraine and the Middle East. And though it is not the ideal scenario, let me defend it anyway. In a world that is divided over what constitutes the truth, and one that is increasingly authoritarian, we need journalists with the backing of strong institutions from democratic countries who can ask the tough questions and tell the sensitive stories without fear. Back when I wrote about torture in Syria's expansive prison system, for example, as a Canadian journalist, I was simply blacklisted. And after years of covering Syria, I could no longer get a visa to go there anymore. A local journalist would have ended up in one of those prisons, possibly never to be seen again, and many have. We also need courageous journalists who work for big organizations to lend their powerful voices and platforms to those out there who are powerless. People like Alex Crawford and her crew from Sky News, who spirited away one night in 2017 at great risk on a rickety wooden boat to cross the water to bring to the world the first evidence of the flight from atrocities inside Myanmar against the Rohingya people. We also need journalists who know how to navigate war zones, and like it or not, it is a specialty that takes years to hone across many geographies and locales. The likes of Lise Doucette and Lindsay Helsom, or Paul Workman, Clarissa Ward, Margaret Evans, and Paul Hunter, they weren't born knowing how to walk through a war zone. They had to go through many war zones to learn how to do it. They spent most of a career learning how to safely cross multiple borders and how to quickly put on a flak jacket, operate inside a hostile zone, yet stay out of trouble and do their job despite the dangers. We also need journalists who can maintain some distance from the events they cover. I am not talking about objectivity. I am talking about the need for journalists who can be fair and impartial in covering the world, and be distant enough to be unencumbered by the fear that their home has been destroyed or their family killed in a conflict zone. We need journalists who, by the sheer luck of where they were born, can board a plane and go home at the end of a horrific assignment and find the support necessary to process their experiences. Finally, and just as importantly, we also need journalists with the experience and the mileage to be able to place the events they are covering in the larger context. That education is also best acquired through covering the world firsthand. Now, having said all that, we have to get away from thinking that there is only one answer to the question of who should be covering the world on behalf of Canadians. To understand our complicated world, we need all the tools at our disposal. We don't have to choose between the foreign correspondent flown in from abroad for her international experience and perspective and distance from the events she's covering, as I've just explained, and the reporter or producer or photographer hired locally for her lived experience, language skills, and intimate knowledge of her country. We need them both. And there's been no better argument in favor of the local journalist recently than the story of Gaza, which served both to highlight the limitations of the Paris shooting foreign correspondent and the importance of employing local ones. Since October 7th, 2023, despite repeated calls from well-respected journalism organizations from around the world, journalists have not been able to access Gaza, and Israel has allowed journalists in only as embedded with its defense forces. And in the absence of the world's foreign correspondents, we have all had to rely heavily on local journalists who have been live reporting the conflict that they've been living daily, with dozens of those journalists being killed in the process of doing so. Beyond Gaza, all around the world, where possible, we can work more collaboratively with local journalists to help enrich the stories that we tell when we're there, and then support them to be able to tell stories themselves when we are not. In all cases, we need to do more to ensure the work of local journalists is recognized and visible, and that they too are protected when the authorities or the growing army of media critics, online or off, threaten them and their families. There are other creative solutions that can help stretch our dollars, improve our international coverage, and better reflect growing diversity in our audiences. My own start as a foreign correspondent is one example that I wish we saw more of today. And so allow me just to give you a sense of how that came about. It was just shortly after 9/11, and it was hard if you watched television at the time or read some of the newspapers to miss that the coverage of the Middle East and its people was problematic. It was simplistic, it was riddled with generalizations, and it often relied on the same tropes as they had for decades. But good editors at the time recognized that there was a gap in our newsrooms, and they sought out people who could help fill those gaps. And so suddenly, Arabic speakers and Middle East experts of all kinds were in demand, especially as the story began to shift to the Middle East and as the drums of war were beating for Iraq. At the time, there was a CBC Jerusalem bureau, but there was no Arab World Bureau, not since the Lebanese Civil War, when CBC had a bureau there headed by Anne Medina, as I mentioned. There were many thoughtful and measured journalists covering the region at the time. I'm sure some of you remember some of them. Anna Maria Tremonti, Neil MacDonald, Anne Medina, and others, beyond Canada, like Christian Amanpour and others who modeled the importance of nuance and cultural knowledge in foreign reporting. It was seeing those gaps myself that persuaded me to quit my job at the Canadian Press and to move to the Middle East, thinking maybe I could help fill some of those blanks on the eve of yet another Western-led war. And to their credit, the CBC hired me, first on a 10-day-a-month contract, to get into the minutiae, to try to bring a more fulsome perspective of the region to Canadian audiences. And it was seen as cutting edge at the time to do this, to send a print reporter, which is what I was back then, Chris, to a would-be war zone with 2 days of video camera and editing training and calling me a VJ. But more relevant was that I had lived in the Middle East for at least part of my childhood, and thanks to my parents, spoke the language fluently, and therefore brought a more nuanced understanding of the people. I had been a professional journalist for several years, and so I knew what the job entailed, and I'd worked abroad. I'd been in a war zone several times in Afghanistan. So I arrived adamant on providing context to every story, some history, a nod to the culture, and some understanding of the complicated political situation in the Middle East. But wanting that and doing it were two very different things. And in any case, hiring one young, inexperienced videographer was hardly the answer to all that was plaguing reporting from the region. Actually, as an aside, in one perfect illustration of exactly the problem with foreign reporting at that time was in the lead up to the war in Iraq. One of the first times that my picture ended up in the newspaper, it was a headshot of me that it was taken from a live report, it's sort of mid-word. and it was lined up along with a number of other far more established correspondents. And the title of the piece was something like, "Who will be this war's Scud Stud?" I was honored, I think, to be included in that list of possible contenders for that title. But no one was going to give out a prize or a title for nuance and context and history. And in fact, I would learn that keeping those bits in, especially in a television piece, which got shorter with time, would be a perennial fight. It was even worse than I imagined after the US invasion and the war started in earnest, and once the internal conflict inside the country raged. One time, as another example, while Baghdad was tearing itself apart along sectarian lines, I got a call from a senior figure in our newsroom, and he asked me to stop getting into the weeds by talking about Sunni versus Shia Muslim. When I protested that the distinction went to the heart of the conflict in the place where I was spending weeks and months of my life covering a dangerous zone, he said, just try to minimize it when you can. But honestly, that was then. Things have dramatically changed from there, and they have improved. In the wake of the Iraq War, immediately after all of that, we opened the Beirut Bureau, and we hired a cameraman and traveled the whole region to do stories for the National and beyond. Lebanon itself became a story when it slowly started to unravel again, beginning with the assassination of the ex-prime minister in a huge explosion right behind my office and home. The conflict then broke out between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, and having the Bureau there turned out to be prescient and practical. And in between, I traveled between Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, learning more and more about the role of displacement, political repression, poverty, lack of opportunities, and progress in the Arab world, especially for its youth. Of course, I had an advantage because I knew the language and because I understood how to tell those stories for a Canadian audience, but still, I had to rely on a whole army of people. The local journalists and cameramen and producers who took the time to patiently explain things to me on the ground. The driver who routinely, for meager payment, took me to dangerous places. The producers who flew over from Canada to help me tell those stories. The many good people on the desk who always made our stories better. The foreign editor, Brian Christie at the time, part editor and part therapist, who read everything and helped us find our way to the next day's assignment on the big stories. And also the ordinary people who shared their stories with me to help me understand in hope that I could amplify their voices and their plight. All those people and all those experiences each had a hand in producing some of the most pivotal moments in Canadian coverage of the Middle East at that time. Like the day that Egypt began to convulse under the oppressive tactics of the previous president, Hosni Mubarak. Thanks to all those people, I was able to immediately understand why youth were revolting, how their lack of agency on any front had been operating in the background for years before finally exploding onto the streets. And later, when I was based in Europe, I immediately understood the summer of 2015, when tens of thousands of people were making their way on boat and on foot to Europe. Displacement was already the story of the Middle East, but few really wanted to hear about it when I was based there. About how young people were giving up on its future. No one wanted to hear it until they arrived on Europe's doorstep. The point in me relating all this is that it takes a lot of work and a lot of people to amass that kind of knowledge. Doing justice to a story is never the work of one person. But a journalist could never even begin such an extraordinary journey of learning if the opportunity doesn't exist. We need to make more of those opportunities available. We need to recruit and retain people who reflect the diversity of our population, people who could also enrich our foreign coverage and help reflect people's experiences out there more credibly and more authentically. And we need them not only on the air or as byline reporters, but as producers and editors and photographers and managers behind the scenes. And the truth is, we still have a long way to get there. Back to the idea of these news deserts that I talked about initially. They recently expanded where Canadian journalists are concerned. Right now, 2 of the most consequential countries in the world are out of reach of our journalists, China and Russia. It is outside our control whether we have access there or not. Our journalists are simply not welcome in either country, but we have to do more to get around that. We can do that simply by formally assigning reporters and producers and desk editors to beats, areas of the world to which they can specialize so they can keep digging even when they cannot physically go there. We should also provide journalists with the flexibility, the tools, and time and knowledge to do international reporting that is more investigative as a matter of course. There are, as I said before, some excellent examples already in the field by traditional foreign correspondents. The first that comes to mind is Mark McKinney of the Globe and Mail, whose coverage of Russia and Ukraine is among the best in the world, and is revelatory in a way that is rarer than is ideal in Western media. The other example I'll mention is CNN's Nima Al-Bagher, who, to cite one particularly effective example, traveled to Libya along with the producer, Raja Razak, to investigate and gather evidence of African migrants being sold at slave auctions. There are other examples that are less traditional, but are nevertheless increasingly important in helping us uncover wrongdoing, dispel disinformation, and prove what the powers that be might deny. So we've seen organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch either working with news organizations or working alone to use evidence-based investigations to uncover and prove wrongdoing and injustice. But there are others, less traditional areas, who do similar work. The first time I heard of Elliot Higgins was in the early days of the uprising in Syria. And at the time, he worked at home in England, taking care of his young child, to use open source images and geolocation techniques to identify weapons used on civilians on the ground in Syria. Later, Elliot founded Bellingcat, which has grown into a large organization of 30 people in more than 20 countries, among them researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists who help establish facts about a variety of events around the world. They don't describe themselves as journalists. They say they are an intelligence agency for the people. And unlike foreign correspondents, they report on the world's most dangerous zones, but from the comfort of their home or office. But something is working with that approach, because while they don't call themselves journalists, they have won several international journalism awards. And in fact, in recognition of their contributions, one among their ranks, Giancarlo Fiorella, was invited to deliver the Stursburg Foreign Correspondent Lecture at Carleton University, a lecture that I moderate at For Ideas every year. He talked about how the organization uncovered the Ethiopian military's role in a massacre in Tigray, where war has raged for 2 years, using open source imagery and geolocation. He also talked about their work documenting possible Russian war crimes in the conflict in Ukraine. At a time when journalists are often kept out of war zones, Bellingcat has shown the rest of us how we can still report on mass killings and murder and possible war crimes and verify facts without going anywhere near those places. Of course, you'd expect me to say this isn't to say that Bellingcat or others can replace journalistic boots on the ground. As Giancarlo himself said, digital open source investigations cannot and should not replace traditional journalism and journalistic practices. That's never been something that we've advocated or wanted. We strongly believe that the methodology must supplement the many other skills and tools that journalists have in their inventory to help us find and make sense about what's happening in the world. newsrooms are taking up Bellingcat's practices, and Bellingcat actually offers training to journalists. And human rights organizations are also providing that kind of training precisely so journalists could acquire or strengthen those skills. I personally believe that we need to go even further and require that these skills are in the toolkit of every foreign correspondent. Near the end here, let me come back to one last crucial pillar of foreign reporting necessary in this day and age. So we've agreed that nothing makes up for seeing things with our very own eyes, irreplaceable in terms of a public service. But providing context and meaning, it's really what today's foreign correspondents do best. As I said at the start, I truly believe that being a foreign correspondent is a posture. It's a way of thinking about the world and the people in it. It's about seeking out the unseeable in the people and events that shape the world, both abroad and at home, by the way. So that way of thinking requires intense curiosity and deep interest in the human condition, and very attentive ears that are attuned to the minutiae of human life. It requires the ability to make connections, to draw lines on a map that aren't borders, but lines that trace similar ideas across the world. At the heart of that way of thinking is one question. Why? The who, what, when, where. As I said, that's the easy part. It's the why that makes a foreign correspondent, in my view. And it's what makes any journalist. And it's in the asking of the question why, ad infinitum, that we finally begin to get to the essence of things, the essence of what makes us human, the essence of a people, the essence, sorry, I missed my line here, the essence of a culture, the essence of a people, the essence of what makes us human, and all the wonderful and horrific things that we do. Finally, all this requires an intense passion about the world and understanding it. In the words of the late Polish foreign correspondent Ryszard Kapuscinski, reporting on the world is, quote, not a vocation, it's a mission. I wouldn't subject myself, he wrote, to these dangers if I didn't feel that there was something overwhelmingly important about history and about ourselves that I felt compelled to get across. This is more than journalism, he said. Foreign journalism is a mission to provide meaning and to identify and explain the most consequential ideas of our time. Because again, it is ideas that can change the world. The anthropologist Wade Davis, who I mentioned earlier in that interview with Philip Coulter, talked about the inflection point that we're in right now, and how his field contributes to bridging the cavernous divides in our world. He said, and I quote, "Anthropology is the antidote to nativism, the enemy of hate, a vaccine of understanding, tolerance, and compassion that silences the rhetoric of demagogues. Never has the voice of anthropology been more important." And for very similar reasons, I believe, never has the voice of journalists, and in particular, foreign journalists, been more important. At its best, foreign journalism too can be an antidote to nativism, the enemy of hate, a vaccine of understanding, tolerance, and compassion. Here is the evidence in just a small sampling from Canadian journalists abroad in recent days. Jeffrey York in Tehran on women's defiance to hijab laws. Salima Shivji and Glenn Kugelstadt in Amritsar in India about its deportees from the US. Mark McKinnon from Europe on Ukraine at the center of an evolving world order. Margaret Evans in Berlin on the rise of the far right. Stephanie Genzer in Damascus about a country unleashed from dictatorship. Paul Hunter on Trump's fixation with Canada, and Sasha Petrusik on one of the toughest stories in recent years in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
What they collectively provide is a critical public service. They are canaries in the mine. They're our eyes and ears on the present, and they are emissaries from the future, because everything that happens out there eventually has an echo right here in Canada. And it is all of us who intimately stand to lose if we don't pay attention. Back to Giancarlo Fiorella from Bellingcat, he put it this way: there are always going to be powerful people in the world who will want to lie to you, to tell you that they're not committing genocide when they are, that they're not destroying the environment when they are, that they're not stoking racist hatred for political gain when they are. He goes on to say, and so it's always going to be on us, on you personally, to keep your guard up, to make it as difficult as possible for them to lie to you. He encapsulated perfectly the idea that I've been trying to get across today, and that is it takes a village to make sense of a new world as it is unfolding. It takes the journalists and all those who help them practice their craft, but it also takes an engaged audience. I don't have to tell you this, but let me say it this way: make no mistake. What we are living today is the story of our times, and it is a foreign news story first and a local story rolled into one. It is a war story, and it is a clash of ideas. All that chaos, the flurry of demands, the shoot-from-the-hip diplomacy, the upending of things, the new facts on the ground, and the lies in the air, this is our story too, and it's a story that is just beginning. And we, as Canadians, ignore it or trivialize it at our peril. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.